The quiet riverbank I am walking toward this morning was once one of the busiest logging highways in North America. Billions of board feet of white pine floated past this very shore, so many logs that the river itself sometimes disappeared beneath them. Then a lumber baron bought this land for his private estate, and years later his daughter gave it away to everyone. Today it is William O'Brien State Park, a stretch of prairie, forest, and riverfront on the St. Croix River in Minnesota. This is the story of how a river that built an industry became a river that people protect. Come walk it with me. We are in eastern Minnesota, in Washington County, on the western bank of the St. Croix River. The river here forms the border between Minnesota and Wisconsin, flowing south toward its meeting with the Mississippi. The park sits just north of the little village of Marine on St. Croix, roughly an hour northeast of Minneapolis and St. Paul. Downstream lies Stillwater, the old lumber capital of the valley. It is mid-September, 2023, and the first hints of autumn are creeping into the trees. The trail starts easy, rolling through second-growth woods and open grass on its way toward the water. The park holds about 12 miles of hiking trails, ranging from flat riverside strolls to hills that will test your legs. September is a generous month here. The air is cool, the light is soft, and the summer crowds have thinned. Underfoot, the ground tells a story that is far older than any trail sign. Before the saws arrived, the St. Croix watershed held one of the great white pine forests of the continent. These were towering, straight-grained trees, some of them centuries old, spread across a watershed of nearly 8,000 square miles in Minnesota and Wisconsin. To the lumbermen of the 1800s, white pine was close to perfect. It was light, strong, easy to work, and it floated, which meant the river could carry it to market. When loggers looked at the St. Croix Valley, they saw a fortune standing on its banks, and the wave of cutting that followed reshaped this entire landscape. As the trail climbs away from the river, you can feel the land rise in broad steps, like a giant staircase. These benches are not accidents of the trail builders. They are river terraces, and each one marks an older, higher level of the St. Croix. The park's ground rises from about 690 feet at the riverbank to over 1,100 feet at its highest ground. Every step up is a step back in time. The valley itself is a leftover from the Ice Age. During the last glaciation, lobes of ice pushed across this country and buried it in drift, the rock and gravel debris that glaciers leave behind. As the ice melted, torrents of meltwater roared south, sawing down through sandstone and carving the deep valley the river follows today. Each time the flood shrank, it left a terrace stranded above the new channel, and the park preserves several of them. So the staircase under this trail was cut by a river far mightier than the one we see now. The St. Croix of today is just the quiet air of that flood. And there it is, wide, calm, and glittering in the morning light. It is hard to stand here and imagine this river choked bank to bank with pine logs, but that was the reality for decades. The St. Croix was the whole reason people came to this valley in numbers. It was the sawmill's power source, the loggers' highway, and the settlers' front door. Everything that happened here starts with this water. In the autumn of 1838, two lumbermen from Illinois, David Hone and Louis Judd, came up this river scouting for a mill site. The land had just been opened to logging by treaties with the Ojibwe and Dakota, and the white pine was waiting. They chose a spot on the west bank with good water power, a few miles downstream from where I am walking now. Then they went home for the winter and organized a company to come back and build. They named the place Marine, after their hometown in Illinois. The village their company founded, Marine on St. Croix, still sits just south of the park, and it is one of the oldest towns in Minnesota. Walking this shoreline, you are tracing the same waterfront those first millwrights studied in 1838. It is a strange thought on a quiet morning like this. This peaceful stretch of river was once the leading edge of an industrial frontier. The forest around me has grown back over what was essentially a giant open-air factory. On August 24, 1839, the Marine Lumber Company set its saw in motion, the first commercial sawmill in what would become Minnesota. That first winter it cut only about 5,000 board feet of lumber, a modest start for a giant industry. But the mill grew with the territory, and by the 1870s it was turning out some 2 million board feet a year. Over more than half a century of operation, the Marine mill produced roughly 197 million board feet of lumber. The mill finally fell silent in 1895, after the nearby pine was gone. The town, first called Marine Mills, renamed itself Marine on St. Croix. From the trail you can look far up and down the river, and in the logging era every mile of this view would have been working water. Each spring, when the ice went out, the drives began. Logs cut all winter in the North Woods were rolled into the streams and ridden south on the flood. Men balanced on the moving timber with pikes and peavies, steering it downriver. The St. Croix carried the whole harvest of the North Country right past this bank. A log drive was one of the great spectacles of 19th century America and one of its most dangerous jobs. Rivermen worked from first light, wading icy water and running across shifting logs to keep the mass moving. A jam could pile timber into a groaning wall, and breaking it loose could kill the men who tried. Every log was stamped on its end with its owner's mark, like a brand on cattle, so mills downstream could sort out whose wood was whose. For decades, this quiet river below me ran brown with bark and pine. All of that floating timber needed somewhere to be sorted, and that place was just downstream, above Stillwater. The trail bends south here, following the same direction the logs traveled. It is about a dozen river miles from this park to the old boom site. In the peak years, the logs jammed upstream from that boom for miles, a solid carpet of pine reaching back toward where this park now sits. The scale of it is almost impossible to picture from this peaceful bank. The St. Croix boom site operated from 1856 to 1914, and it was the funnel through which the whole valley's timber passed. Chains of floating logs corralled the drives, while men called boom rats scampered over the slippery mass, reading the stamped marks and sorting logs to their owners. An estimated 15.5 billion board feet of white pine passed through the boom in those years. At its peak, wading logs covered more than 9 miles of river upstream. The last log slipped through on June 12, 1914, and the Great Era ended. Today the site is a National Historic Landmark, and the river runs clear again. When the white pine was gone, the lumber companies had little use for this land, and they were happy to sell it. The forest I am walking through now is what grew back, oaks and maples and aspen rising over the old stump fields. It is easy to forget that almost nothing here is untouched. This is a recovered landscape, not a preserved one, and its recovery began with one wealthy family's change of heart. William O'Brien was an Irish-American lumberman who made his fortune in the Stillwater timber trade during the boom years. When the pine gave out and the companies sold off their cut-over land, O'Brien did something unusual. He bought up thousands of acres of it along this stretch of river, not to log it again, but as a personal country estate. The played-out logging land became a rich man's retreat of woods, meadows, and riverfront. O'Brien died in 1925, and the estate passed to his family. What happened next is the reason this park exists. These meadows and oak stands I am crossing were once part of that private estate. For 20 years after William O'Brien's death, this shoreline stayed in family hands while the Twin Cities grew rapidly just an hour away. City people had few public places to reach a wild river. Minnesota's state parks in those days were mostly far from the metro. This land's next chapter came from his daughter. Alice O'Brien was no ordinary heiress. During the First World War, she crossed the Atlantic and volunteered in France with the Red Cross, and back home, she threw her energy into civic causes. In 1945, she offered the state of Minnesota 180 acres of riverfront from her father's estate as a memorial to him. The state eagerly accepted, since the Twin Cities still had no state park nearby, and the legislature formally established William O'Brien State Park in 1947. It became the first state park in the metro region. From that seed of 180 acres, the park has grown tenfold to more than 1,800 acres today. The trail now swings along the shore of a small, calm lake set just back from the river. This is Lake Alice, and yes, it is named for the woman who gave this park away. On a September morning, the water is glassy, ringed by cattails and hardwoods just starting to turn. Anglers come here for the panfish, and families for the swimming beach in summer. It is a gentle centerpiece for a park with such a rough and loud industrial past. Lake Alice covers about 15 acres and is fed by underground springs, which keep its water fresh. The park stocks it with panfish, and fishing from its banks is a favorite first fishing spot for Minnesota kids. Swimming is allowed here rather than in the river, because the St. Croix currents are deceptively strong. A sandy beach on the lake gives summer visitors a safe place to cool off. Naming it for Alice O'Brien was a fitting tribute, quiet, generous, and open to everyone. Down along the floodplain, the river splits into side channels and backwaters, weaving around low wooded islands. This braided water is some of the richest habitat in the park. Herons stalk the shallows, turtles line the deadfall logs, and waterfowl raft in the quiet sloughs. One of those islands out there has its own story of generosity. Like the park itself, it was a gift. In 1958, a donor named S. David Greenberg gave the park an island in the river, in memory of his parents. Greenberg Island lies just offshore, reachable only by canoe or kayak. That isolation is exactly what makes it valuable. With no roads and no trails to speak of, the island has become a haven for wildlife and wildflowers. It is a small wilderness in the middle of a border river, protected by a family's memory. Standing here, it is worth remembering that rivers like this one almost vanished from America. Through the 20th century, the nation dammed, dredged, and polluted most of its great waterways. By the 1960s, free-flowing rivers had become rare enough that Congress finally acted to save the best of what remained. The St. Croix, flowing wide and undammed past this bank, was one of the survivors, and it was about to make history a second time. On October 2, 1968, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act into law. The act protected stretches of just 8 rivers in the entire country, and the St. Croix, together with its tributary the Namekagon, was one of the original 8. That first designation shielded about 200 miles of free-flowing water. In 1972, the lower St. Croix, the stretch flowing past this park, was added to the system as well. A river that once carried an industry on its back became one of the most protected waterways in America. The logging highway had become a national treasure. Leaving the riverbank, the trail climbs the terraces toward the park's western uplands. The forest opens as you rise, giving way to grassland dotted with spreading oaks. This is not wasteland or old farm field left to chance. It is a landscape that park managers have been deliberately rebuilding for decades. Up here, the story of William O'Brien State Park turns from preservation to restoration. Before settlement, much of this upland was prairie and oak savanna, scattered bur oaks standing over a sea of tall grass and wildflowers, kept open by wildfire. Plowing and grazing nearly erased that world from Minnesota. Today the park protects a mosaic of prairie, oak savanna, floodplain, and hardwood forest across its more than 1,800 acres. Crews use seed gathering and carefully managed prescribed fire to bring the grasslands back. In late summer, these meadows glow with goldenrod, asters, and big bluestem grass taller than a hiker. It is a working restoration you can walk straight through. Dropping back toward the river, the trail runs through hardwoods that have been recovering for more than a century. Oaks, maples, basswood, and aspen now stand where the cutover once sprawled. In a few weeks, these hills will burn with autumn color, one of the best shows in the St. Croix Valley. Given enough time, even a landscape stripped to stumps can become beautiful again. That may be the most hopeful lesson this park teaches. The recovered valley has refilled with life. White-tailed deer browse the meadow edges, and beavers work the backwaters as they have for centuries. The river corridor is a flyway, busy with waterfowl, songbirds, and wading birds, and bald eagles patrol the open water. Lake Alice and the sloughs shelter turtles, frogs, and muskrats. A century ago, this was an industrial corridor thick with sawdust and bark. Today, it is one of the metro region's great wildlife refuges. Being the closest riverside state park to the Twin Cities, William O'Brien has become a beloved escape. Campers fill its drive-in and cart-in sites, paddlers launch canoes for the channels around Greenberg Island, and skiers glide these same trails all winter. Yet even on a busy weekend, the park absorbs its visitors gently. There is always a quiet bend of trail or an empty stretch of bank. Generosity built this park, and it still feels generous. Think about the chain of gifts that made this morning's walk possible. Alice O'Brien gave 180 acres in memory of her father, and the state built a park on it. David Greenberg gave an island in memory of his parents. Later additions grew the park to 10 times its original size, and the nation itself gave the river lasting protection. None of that was inevitable, and all of it can be traced on a single walk. A park like this is simply generosity, made permanent and handed forward. The loop is closing now, and the trail carries me back along the water one last time. The morning fog has burned off, and the St. Croix slides past, bright and unhurried, the way it has since the meltwater floods faded. Somewhere under these banks lie sunken logs still stamped with their owner's marks, the river's own archive. Above them, herons fish the same shallows the boom rats once ran across. It is a rare thing, a place where you can walk through an entire industrial age and out the other side into wild country again. William O'Brien State Park is the whole story of the St. Croix in miniature. A glacial river, a great pine forest, the first sawmill in Minnesota, the log drives, the baron, and the daughter who turned his estate into everyone's park. If you come, walk the riverside to Lake Alice, climb the terraces to the prairie, and give yourself time to simply stand at the water. Some rivers are lucky enough to get a second life, and this is what one looks like. Thank you for watching. Follow for more of the trails of the world.